Okay, so just to give a short reminder, in the next 75 minutes, we will travel intellectually. Okay, so of course, we are exploring various countries, how they approach the complex and often controversial landscape about solar radiation modification or geoengineering. We will be traveling from Ghana to South Asia to Arctic, and of course, our speakers, they will share how stakeholders, government officials, researchers, media, and even communities are perceiving and engaging with these emerging technologies. So we know that these insights will shed us light in terms of governance, perception, and ethical dimensions across various cultural and geographic locations. So this is just a reminder for our presenter to give their 15-minute presentations and to be followed by question and answer after all the presentations will be concluded. And I may kindly ask everyone to please respect the time limit so that we can engage in a meaningful discussion. Now let's begin. Our first presentation, titled Driving Effective Governance on Solar Radiation Modification in Ghana, Exploring Stakeholders Networks. This will be delivered to us by Dr. Portia Adade Williams, a research scientist at the Science and Technology Policy Research Institute. The floor is yours, Dr. Adade.
Thank you, Lorena. And good morning, everyone. Apologies, I was running up here, so I'm panting a bit. So yeah, I'm pleased to share some findings from our project, which is a degree-funded project. I hope you can hear me. Okay. Yeah, it's a degree-funded project, a socio-political funded project. So it's more on the social science side. That is looking at driving driving effective governance on SRM in Ghana. Um, we're trying to explore existing stakeholder networks. So it's coming from the main project assessment of knowledge and governance towards SRM in Ghana. We are trying to pull implications for more efficient ethical policy and social practices. So this you see here is a list of the team members. So before I get started, I know even by now today is the last day of the conference, so we all know how governance issues are kind of evolving, and we also know we don't even have any existing framework now that is really driving either research or deployment. And so if you take it even from the African perspective, we would say, let me put it, we are the baby face now. We are even working more on sensitization among others and getting into the research. And so when we talk about governance, we are getting started. And so this quote here, which is saying that SRM governance must be grounded in the voices and values of those already shaping a country's climate future, is what really is driving this assessment we did. So it means if we want to work on governance and if you want to start pushing on governance, even as a country like Ghana, then we need to work with those who are already in the climate space, the existing climate stakeholders. And so what our work went in to do is to engage those people. But then not to talk so much about the background, but to say that SRM indeed, it matters for all globally, but in the vulnerable context like Ghana, where we have experienced high exposures of droughts, floods, extreme events, we cannot be left out of the global discussion. And of course, evidently, if we say Ghana in a changing climate, when we talk about the droughts, floods, and the extreme events, it's evident, it's been well documented among others. And so the stakeholder net mapping we are doing is to get into an anticipatory mood of how even going to SRM governance it will be for the country. So we just went in there to engage to ensure that do we have the institutional capacity as at now? if we are to get into the governance space. So that is basically what we did. And so how did we do it? We, like I said, we engaged with stakeholders within the climate change space already. We met with them. We presented SRM to them. Let's say SRM 101, which would say majority of them were even hearing it for the first time, as expected. But after going through the session with them, then we thought of now trying to understand the whole landscape of stakeholders. We had different categories. We have research and academia represented. We have public institutions and agencies presented. We had NGOs, CSOs. We had the media there. We had a couple of them there. So what was our interest? Our interest was to know who are the key stakeholders. They are the people driving climate agenda already in Ghana. But after hearing about SRM, we know they are the same people who will still fall on. But then our interests were who are they really? And how are they connected or linked in the work they do? And how influential are they in Ghana? If you are talking about policy planning, formulation, implementation, uptake, among others. But with that, we were very curious to ask um, who takes oversight responsibility on climate issues in the country, the technical advice, the communication, advocacy, funding, and capacity building. These were the category of interest we had. And then on a large sheet of paper, we drove the discussions. And so we also documented fiscally to show them what the networks are, their responses they gave us, among others. And what did we do? When we got all those responses, so each sheet presents a category of stakeholder. And then the lines you see connecting them, it's either saying maybe advocacy or funding or maybe oversight responsibility, among others. So we did that and put it in a software called Visualizer to now give us an idea of the whole landscape. So yes, we put it in Excel and then run it through Visualizer, and then it gave us an idea of the complete net map of key climate actors in Ghana. So those in green you see are development partners. Those in red are civil society NGO. Those in, should I say pink, purple, are the research academia. Those in yellow are government and policy making institutions. And those in blue are media. Yeah, these were the main kind of broad categorization we got. And the lines you see going all over the place, plenty. When you see this, so this pink side is showing more of funding for climate research. The ones in green is showing communication and dissemination. You see a bit of yellow showing oversight responsibility. But interestingly, to show you that so these are the government institutions, and you see the kind of linkages they have in the network. They are not super active in the network. Um, they, yeah, I'll break it down a bit in the following slide, but just to show you that you see how our development partners are very active in there with all these lines linking them. And also, we have our research and academia also quite active in there. And then we have the media playing a role and then the CSO. But you see how scattered government institutions are. So oversight responsibility of climate change issues. As you can see here, it's mainly, so the yellow ones are the government institutions, and they mainly take oversight responsibility about whoever. Oversight meaning activities for those categories of stakeholders are handled by the government institutions. So it's mainly any oversight responsibility, as you can see, this is um, research academia, the blue is media, the red is civil society. Almost all categories of stakeholders are overlooked by government institutions. Technical advice gave us some interesting outputs. We are expecting that the research institutions will be quite active when it comes to technically advising. But you see, the research institutions are the ones in purple. They might be hiding in here, but they are not really active here. And already showing us a bit of a gap. But then we are seeing that the CSOs are quite active in the space, as well as the um, development partners, because mainly when the research is done, because the development partners are mostly driving our research agenda, the researchers kind of engage and disseminate the information directly to them. But when it comes into the space of kind of taking charge to get it out there, researchers are quite, they are very quiet in here. And then we see that the media, the CSO, and the development partners are the ones driving that agenda. Funding, obviously, we see our development partners very active in there. And if you see the government institutions, if you see the network quite closely, if the funding is development partners pushing more funding even into the government institution. It means public funding already is a big challenge. But then if we are to learn from what's happening elsewhere, if we see the kind of advice our EU experts gave to the governments of EU recently coming out, they are advising that you fall more on public funding to drive this. I think we are not there yet. Even the government institutions are falling more on the development partners, and some of the civil societies also controlling the agenda in there. Communication and dissemination, I think it's a quite a fair network to see the main stakeholders all kind of being actively in there. Advocacy, also, we are seeing the CSOs in the middle actively doing that and the development partners. And few government agencies also actively in there. But then the main thing is happening between CSOs and development partners. Pardon me for this, but it might not be clear, but this is to show the degree of centrality, to show how active a stakeholder is in the whole network. So how many movements are coming to you and how many is going out. That actually also shows the influence you have. And then if you have to really drive SRM governance like our work is looking at, then we will know who are the very active ones. And we need to really talk to some stakeholders to maybe come up a bit with their activeness. So you see that the CSOs, you might not understand this acronym, but mainly to show that the CSOs are actually the most active. They are giving out and they are taking in a lot of engagement within the network. And it's mainly followed by the development partners. Most of the institutions you see down here are government institutions. 15 minutes, so I need to really kind of end it. But then we are already seeing a gap. In the stakeholders we met with, there were private actors as well. But within the network and in our engagement with them, we saw how quiet they are within the network. Beyond this, we are going to engage further actually after this conference. We are going to engage individual stakeholders in a focus group. So we are going to meet with the private sector to understand a bit more because with the meeting we had, there were issues with regulations on some of the activities they do among others. So we are going to unpack that a bit, meet each category of stakeholder to understand much deeper. And also we saw that judiciary and legal structures, their activeness, even though they were not present, but some were not present, but through the discussions they came up. But we saw that it was very quiet. But if you are going into SRM governance, we would need such category of stakeholders strongly in there. And also, we saw that in the identification of stakeholders in the activities they do, we were quite open to link up with maybe at the regional level, maybe within Africa, the continent, or at the global level. But we saw that the linkages were not really going much outside. But SRM is a global thing, and if we need to prepare ourselves, even in the governance space, then we need to see how well we can improve that kind of linkages. And so it's in kind of some insights given us is we know Ghana is having a multi-tiered governance system where we have the national level, the regional, and then the district local level. And understanding the power and influence of these stakeholders is very key if we want to really drive this and get into the space of governance. And we see a lot of opportunities maybe for cross-sectoral engagement that needs to improve. And that's where maybe capacity building is very key for us as a country. My last slide is just some kind of conclusions and recommendations coming from this work, where we have already seen that there are some capacity gaps within our stakeholder system that we need to fill in, and also build more awareness and literacy, because as I said, when we met, majority of them, it was even the first time they were hearing about SRM. And also try to establish more dialogue at the national level to open up deliberation on it, and also try to, as I said earlier, improve on cross-sectoral networks and engagements to better prepare ourselves, and also connect actors more in their networking activities at the regional and global level. Um, Also to look at what is happening elsewhere in other countries and see where we can leverage and learn also from it. So yes, my last point is, I'm saying driving effective SRM governance is not really deciding yes or no, as we have heard mostly from the conference as at now, but preparing to be very informed, empowered, and also shaping how and how is very, very key if we want to get into this space. And so it makes the stakeholder network kind of a backbone to get into this space more broadly. So thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for such insightful presentation, Dr. Portia. And please reserve your question to her, because we are going to entertain the second presenter. Let me introduce to you our second presenter, Dr. Shaun Fitzgerald. He is the director at the Center for Climate Repair at the University of Cambridge. He will present to us titled Deciphering Public Attention to Geoengineering and Climate Issues Using Language Models and Dynamic Analysis. Dr. Shaun?
Great. Okay. Well, good morning, everybody. Or actually, now good afternoon. So this talk on media stories and public interest in geoengineering was spawned, or this work was spawned, as a result of my previous experience. So before I joined the Centre for Climate Repair, I was director at the Royal Institution in London. And the Royal Institution in London is the oldest entity in the United Kingdom that was associated with engaging the public, giving talks to the public on science. So it heralds back to the areas of Michael Faraday and some of the amazing lectures that were given there. And they still have the lecture theatre there. And when I started at the Royal Institution, I had heard about the term public understanding of science. And, I was adjusted by my team. In other words, we don't use that term anymore, Shaun. Public understanding of science, that's old hat. We use the term public engagement, which I fully accepted. And I thought, okay, well, this is about engaging the public in a dialogue. However, when I went back to Cambridge to go and lead the Centre for Climate Repair, I reflected on the term public understanding of science. And although the term itself I realised was old and wrong, perhaps the words were not. And perhaps they were simply in the wrong order. And the reason is this: if you want to be successful at engaging the public, you need to understand your audience. So actually what we need to do is increase the level of understanding that the scientists have of the public. So increasing scientists' understanding of the public. And that is what this research is about, to see whether we can get a better understanding of how the public really respond to different media stories and things like this. So the questions that were I have of interest in terms of if we want to improve our level and ability to engage with the public are as follows. For example, what topics stimulate an interest in things like this overall term called geoengineering, climate interventions? How does the framing of those topics in the media perhaps alter the level of interest? Does interest in the topic of geoengineering or associated terms, actually does it immediately follow a trigger event, or is there a delay? These are the questions I think are important to know. Is the interest sustained? Because if it's not sustained, actually maybe it's just a flash in the pan. We need to know about that, because that will then inform our ability to engage. And then lastly, what kind of interest Are you actually stimulating? And are you interested in an inquiring mind that want to know more, actually, or do people just want to kill it? So actually, just the framing, these are the sorts of questions. And we haven't been able to address all of these in the research to date, but these are some of the questions that I think are quite helpful. And I am joined by a number of academics at the University of Cambridge and Michael Alvarez from Caltech, and they're data scientists. And this is a complementary approach to trying to improve our understanding of the public. So instead of asking questions, can we go back in time, look at the history of, for example, news stories and things like this, so without perturbing. So the moment you ask a question of somebody, who asked the question, how you ask it, when you ask it, will actually influence the answer that you get. And it's great for certain parts of analysis. This approach, where we look back in time, has benefits in that you're not actually perturbing the system, but it has disbenefits in that it's quite opaque. In other words, you're not as focused. So that's why I think these two different approaches are complementary to each other. So how do we answer them? So we've looked at news stories over the last 5 years in the BBC and New York Times. The BBC, in 1 year will have 1.1 billion views. So it's actually, it has a lot. I'm not saying it's representative of the world, but BBC News does cover the world, but there are certain areas of the world that will read more of the BBC than others. But it's a convenient data source, corpus, of which we're able to interrogate. So we've used the New York Times and the BBC over 5 years, and also with something called Google Trends. So we're working with Google, and basically when you type something into a search engine and you hit return, we've got that information, or rather Google have. And it's just kind of scary in a way, really. But it's quite useful, therefore, to be able to look at what people are searching for and how might that correlate with the news stories, to see whether we can get any insights regarding interest in the field of geothermal and geoengineering. So how does Google Trends work? It has access to basically large, unfiltered search inquiries. I fully recognise, or we fully recognise, that yes, it reflects the searches, but we need to be cognizant that there are also bots and things like that you need to sort of just try and figure out. And there are approaches that you can use to try and understand whether it's more likely to be a bot that's searching for something or whether it's individuals. If it's just one-offs, try and sort of ensure that those are not getting a high weighting in terms of our analysis. So it filters out searches made by very few people. And our working assumption is that the search volume of geoengineering related words indicates public interest in the topic. It's a working assumption. I'm not saying that is true, but it's like a hypothesis that we're running with. So prior research suggests that actually public responses to media, they don't necessarily follow immediately, a delayed trajectory, particularly for complex and emerging issues. And this is not to do with geoengineering. This is just previous research. So the references are on the bottom there. And therefore, in order to try and help the research be a bit more efficient, we have a hypothesis, which is that public interest in geoengineering follows a time lag, don't know what it is, but a time lag correlation with media coverage of things like climate environmental issues. And then hypothesis 2 is there are two things that are at stake here. There is something called the agenda setting theory, and that's based on how media shapes public attention on a topic over time. So the topic. And then the second thing is that the way that that topic is actually described, portrayed in the media, the way it's portrayed, the framing of it, also affects the interest in a given topic. And the one that clearly we're interested in is in geoengineering. So hypothesis 2 is that different climate-related topics, which include energy and things like that, and their sentiment. So the underlying sentiment, was it a positive story? Was it a negative story? Was it neutral? Actually contribute differently to variations in public attention. And we're going to test that hypothesis. So we're not saying that this is right. We're just going to test the hypothesis. So what we've done is that we've sort of collected a bunch of terms, so geoengineering related terms that people type into Google. And the sorts of things that we've looked at are, they vary from afforestation. Clearly, they include things like aerosol injection. They do include geoengineering, but also a bunch of others. So it's slightly out with the topic of this conference of solar radiation modification, that it includes things like enhanced weathering, which are more akin to carbon dioxide removal, but that has been spoken about only this morning, for example. So a broad range of approaches, and we are first identify and input the various terms of interest, followed by setting design time lag, and we're going to go and look at the correlation for that. And the Google Trends Index then provides us data on search frequencies for a specified term. And what we've done is that we've invented a new sort of term called the Geoengineering Attention Index, which looks at the frequency, actually the amount of evidence behind a given search term, so the strength of that as well. And we've used this as a geoengineering attention index in order to say now we're going to go and correlate that and figure out how that maps to different news stories over the last 5 years. So, to test hypothesis one, we've done a correlation analysis between climate-related media coverage and public interest in geoengineering. Now, specifically, if you're interested, the thing is, it's called a Pearson correlation coefficient. And it looks at the media intensity coverage and the geoengineering related global trends data across a different range of time lags. And then we're interested in trying to understand what that time lag is. Is it a day? Is it a week? Is it actually even longer? Because that will have some bearing about how do we, as a community, there think about our way that we might engage the public. It's really important to understand the time lag. And then the second thing is we've used large language models in order to try and get a better understanding of the sentiments which are being used by a given journalist, for example, describing a story. And we use this thing called BERT-based topic modeling. That's bidirectional encoder representations from transformers, if you're not used to it. But basically, it's developed by Google researchers. So these are large language models where we're able to try and get a better insight about the overall tone without us having to read, for example, all of the news stories over the last 5 years. We can't do that. So we've got to do this in an automated way, and that's what this analysis is about. So it basically embeds the sentiments, and we then categorize those ranging from very positive to very negative. And then after this, we then look at this with machine learning models to look at regression features against Google Trends data. And this is sort of the results that we found for, first of all, on the time lag. And I found it really quite surprising. And it was across both the data sources, BBC and New York Times. You can argue, though, well, are they similar journalists? Because it's Western world, it's English speaking, global North, and actually are they covering the same story? So that's the concern I've got regarding this. Nevertheless, it's saying that actually there is quite a time lag. And it's like 25 weeks, not 25 days. So this is like half a year. So just thinking about this, about the long game that we might need to play when we're talking about engagement and stories, and it isn't just a one-off news story. Actually, this is going to need to be over some time if you wish to be in it for the long time. So 25-week lag, that's important. And then in terms of the topics, what we've done is this thing called a SHAP, that's Shapley Additive Explanations, and it's a game theoretic approach to explaining predictions of machine learning models. And what we found is that the topics that stimulate the greatest interest in geoengineering kind of searches are things related to the energy and the economy. There are some other topics as well, but these are the ones that dominate. And then finally, it's not just the topics, but how are those topics then expressed? What's the sentiment behind them? And actually what we're finding is it's positive news stories on energy and the economy, not negative stories, that actually generate more interest in geoengineering kind of related terms. And I find this really, really interesting in terms of, therefore, what is it that we should be doing and thinking about our way of engaging with the media and hence, therefore, through to the wider public. So, yeah, energy and economy and the positive news stories associated with those are important. Now, there are other topics, medical, disaster, politics, they also contribute, but basically we found their values vary across different models, these are across different large language models, and therefore we don't have the same degree of certainty behind that. So that's why we're saying the ones that we've got greater confidence in are on energy and the economy and positive news stories. So in summary, there's clearly a dominant role for these in driving geoengineering interest, and the positive sentiment associated with those is important if we want to sort of try and think about when you might want to talk about geoengineering, or if you're going to go and put a story out there, think about the kind of events that are relevant. Is a climate disaster actually the right time to be talking about geoengineering if you want to stimulate interest in it? Beg the question. And then public engagement, this is a long game, and that's what I also learned at the Royal Institution. You don't do this just once. It's continued, and you've got to build it gradually over time. So the potential insights from this work. if you want to be really effective at communication and engagement and getting interest in the kind of work that we're interested in, is it right to use terms such as emergency, crisis, disaster, act now? And I have to say, I've heard quite a lot of that in this community, all right? Maybe not literally in this room or in the rooms around here, but in the wider community, this is some of the language that I have seen quite commonly used. And I'm just posing a question of, is that less effective, more effective? Are things like, on the energy storage, the energy transition, we're making progress, but actually not quite sufficient? Does that actually get more buy-in, more interest in terms of, well, what else might we be able to do? Because people actually don't like negative stories. In other words, they just shut down. We're not, it closes off interest if you say, oh, we're all doomed. So actually, maybe this is teaching us that you put something more of a positive spin in terms of, or a positive story that there is an energy transition, we're just not moving fast enough. That might be a better way of getting engagement than saying, actually, look at all of the disasters. And what about the opportunities, rather than it being a crisis? We need to be patient. Perhaps I'm speaking a bit too quickly and therefore I'm not particularly patient, but that's a failing of Shaun. But we need to play the long game and be patient, and then say persistence of engagement. So I hope that's been helpful, and I look forward to sort of answering trying to answer some of your questions at the end. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Dr. Shen, for such a fascinating and timely analysis. Okay, now let's proceed with our third speaker. Our third speaker, no other than Professor Sadique Rahman from Sher-e-Bangla Agricultural University. He will be presenting to us public perception and expert opinion regarding solar radiation modification in the context of a South Asian developing country.
My study is about the perception of different stakeholders in Bangladesh, which is a South Asian country. Basically, it's a degree-funded project. So we're basically in the middle of this project. So the presentation is more academic on my one is and it will be difficult to draw a conclusion from this because we are in the middle of this project. We have two parts, basically qualitative and quantitative parts. So I'll show some findings from the qualitative ones. So what people think about SRM in Bangladesh, country like Bangladesh basically. So this is my research team, and I'm very much grateful for their support. Introduction, I will not say all of these things. I hope you have seen the documentary, the Plan C for Civilization. So that basically feature Bangladesh. That's basically tell you why it is important. Basically, the geographical setting, if you see the geographical setting, it is in between Himalayas and Bay of Bengal. So it's basically prone to different types of climatic event, extreme event. In last 10 years, or maybe from 2010 to 2020, we faced around 185 extreme event, like floods, we have increased temperature, we have droughts, different types of climatic events in 10 years basically. So that's why it is important to know the perception of the stakeholders of Bangladesh regarding the alternatives we have to reduce the temperature. It is one of the potential SRM technology, but it's also have some different types of controversial issues basically regarding the risks and benefits. So what we have done in this study, we basically inform the stakeholder about SRM. In Bangladesh, if you think about Bangladesh, you can say almost 100% people doesn't know about SRM. So what we have done, we basically provide them some basic information before we start the interviews. Then based on that information, we have tried to collect their perception. We have two main questions. So first one is that do the respondent possess knowledge about climate change? We first try to identify that whether they know about what is climate change, what are the effect of climate change. Then we have given them a scenario that we have SRM, and then they have basically their opinion regarding the risk, benefit, governance, and geopolitical issues of SRM in Bangladesh. We mainly used the qualitative approaches. We did some FGDs, and we also did some key informant interviews. So we conducted 17 key interviews. Out of this 17, 4 were government policymakers. We went to different ministries and we have talked with them. 7 are NGO participants. They are basically dealing with climate change related issues. And 6 are from researchers or academicians. And we have also conducted 6 FGDs in different parts of Bangladesh. In Bangladesh, we have basically 6 climatic hotspot. We have hill areas, we have coastal areas, we have drought-prone areas. So we went in different parts of the country, and we conducted these 6 FGDs. The stakeholder involved basically the farmers. We have a student, and we also have some service holder. That's basically a more or less a methodology one. Basically give them some visual card before starting the interview to give them some idea about SRM. For FGD, we also have some detailed PowerPoint presentation before starting the discussion. Then basically we sum up with their conclusion. For research question, basically try to estimate the effect of climate change in terms of these 3 issues. Environmental resources, then livelihood and lives. We asked different questions regarding environmental resources, their livelihood pattern and lives, what are the effect of climate change. So whether they know about climate change or not, we try to estimate this. So effect on environmental resources, if we see the last statement, I'm just quoting it. A farmer said that rise in temperature is the most experienced climatic change in our life. So basically this is one of the issue the farmers of Bangladesh basically right now facing, the increasing temperature. When you come towards the livelihood issue, they basically mentioned that their crop production, livestock or fisheries is going down basically. And also the day laborer cannot work in the field because of increasing heat. Heat stroke is also increasing. This is also creating an issue. And then effects on life, the participant also highlighted the health risks of population. One of the participants mentioned that in coastal areas, women have to use the saline water for household purposes. They have to stay long in saline water. Sometimes they also use fishing in saline water. So they have to stay a long time in saline water. That basically creating their reproductive health issues. So this is also another issue coming up in Bangladesh due to salinity intrusion. So overall, the participant emphasizes that urgent need for robust climatic action in Bangladesh. Then we give them the opportunity that we have solar radiation management, some of the combination of technology, what are the perceptions about that. So if I go by stakeholder farmers, they are basically very much positive about solar radiation management. Every research, whatever research, whether it is deployment, or they are very much positive. It's very difficult right now. So why they are very positive? To conclude, to explain it, but maybe one of the reason is that they are the first people who faces the risks of climate change. They are facing that crop production is going down, their health hazard is increasing. That's why they think the alternative can help them to reduce this effect. Alternatively, there is another option. If you think about Bangladesh, historically they are basically less educated, the farmers category. So that may be another reason. Their awareness, their knowledge level may be another issue. That they are not basically capturing what is SRM. So they are basically giving, I am very much positive you can implement it. In the case of student and researcher, they are very much smart in giving some answer. They both of this category basically say it's supportive of more responsible research. Otherwise, they will unable to give some comments or perception. Policymaker, when you went to them, they basically straight said no. There is no need to go for such advanced technologies right now. Focus on the reduction of emission and necessary adaptation measure. They are basically supportive of adaptation measure. In case of, if you think about Bangladesh, NGOs also overall, if you think they are also not very positive at this stage. Their opinion is like that with so many critical climate challenges, why should SRM should be prioritized? And who will compensate if there is any negative effect, if there is any risk, then who will compensate these developing countries after implementing this SRM. So we also asked them about the perceived risks of SRM by different stakeholders. First one is very common, unpredictable changes, monsoon pattern might affect food security, that's we all know. Second one is proper management. There is also one kind of perceived risks in Bangladesh, because for a country like Bangladesh, we don't have any advanced technologies. So it will be very difficult if we go for even for a small trial in Bangladesh of SRM. To manage it properly, it will be very difficult. Sustainability is another issue regarding the SRM. It mainly deals with the, if you see the statement of a researcher, that since it needs maintenance and also several attempts to reduce the temperature, and once it is started, it will be continuous process. Otherwise, there will be some negative effect basically. Then in long run, who will ensure the continuity? So this type of statement are basically coming when talk with sustainability. What will be the greenhouse gas emission? This is another risk factor. They are basically pointing out this variation in agriculture productivity that will be a huge effect on Bangladesh, because it depends on agriculture. So the variety we have currently, it's basically suitable for current climatic situation. If we start experimenting SRM, temperature get down, then we need new type of varieties, crop varieties, which require decades of time to develop in this type of varieties. So that may be another issue. Financial and compensation, this is another issue. Like one expert said that we are already suffering from the climate change, still not able to get demanded compensation. So who guaranteed compensate of unwanted risks of misuse of SRM? So we're still not getting the demanded loss and damage compensation from IPCC or something like that. But in that case, again, we are imposing some SRM type of technology, then it may increase the risks basically. In terms of perceived benefit, they think that since it reduces some temperature, heat stroke and other health issue maybe get lower than disease of like dengue and malaria will got. We also have support. Different modeling study also suggested that disease infestation or disease outbreak will be lower. And another thing is post-harvest loss will be minimum. They think this can be a benefit of SRM. Since temperature will go down, people need less amount of energy, so that the same amount of energy can be invested in cold storage and other type of thing. That will increase the post-harvest basically activities basically. Geopolitical concern, when we ask about them about the geopolitical concern, their perception basically move around these four things. First one is risks and compensation. As I mentioned earlier, who bear the risks of implementing SRM at global scale? That is a major issue. And alternative justification of causes of climate change. This type of statement is also coming from the stakeholders from Bangladesh. I mean, they're trying to say that the developed country cannot reduce emission as they promised, so they are exploring alternative justification by SRM. This is basically their opinion that it may be another concern. Power and negotiation, if you think about power and negotiation, developing country doesn't have the technology to implement or even do some small scale trial of SRM. All this technology remains with global north. So when we think about the negotiation, their bargaining power will be always low because they don't have this technology. They cannot do it. They have to depend on global north for implementing this. So their bargaining power will always be low. A global convention is needed. There is also another geopolitical concern. The participants suggested that in-country or individual level policy implication will not work. Maybe an NGO, maybe some donor agency can develop a guideline, ethical guideline of SRM, but they are very much concerned then why the government of Bangladesh or government of India like that will follow this guideline. So they basically suggested a government involvement is required, otherwise this type of global convention will not work in future. So governance and policy framework, if we think for Bangladesh, it is too early at this stage because the risks are not known. Technology is also not known. What they're suggesting that community engagement or capacity building and consensus building is required if you want to include SRM in the policies of developing countries. What I found when I went for example, for climate scientists who are dealing with modeling, they doesn't have any knowledge how governance work. When I talk with the social scientists, they doesn't know the science behind SRM. So capacity building at both levels is required. Otherwise, you cannot include it in a policy. And it should be led by government institution. They are not relying on NGOs or individual institution or universities. They are suggesting that all the government should take the lead of this research activities, then NGOs and academia can play a support role. Otherwise, this policy and government's framework will not be successful. So in conclusion, it will be difficult to draw something at this stage, but we can say that several stakeholders showed a positive attitude toward SRM, but most of them are seriously concerned about the risks associated with it. Much debate basically concentrate on the geopolitical implication of SRM technology, which casts a doubt on Bangladesh's bargaining power and influence. To be considered for policy inclusion in a country like Bangladesh, more awareness building or capacity development initiative is required, and also the empirical evidence is needed. Without strong empirical evidence, no one will agree to include it in a policy. So I think that's it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Professor Rahman, for that comprehensive presentation. And finally, we are on our fourth speaker. We have Cody Skahan. He is a PhD student from the University of Oxford. His presentation titled The Arctic Laboratory, Perception and Engagement of Geoengineering in Iceland. Cody, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Yes, like Lorena said, I am a PhD student in anthropology at the University of Oxford. I believe I might be the only anthropologist at this conference. Please let me know if I'm wrong. I would love to talk to them. But that means I do have to give some clarifications about my research methods, my research project. I'm also a first-year PhD student, so essentially what I'm presenting today is a combination of findings from my master's research in Iceland at the University of Iceland, but also my future plans for my research for my PhD that'll be starting, my fieldwork will be starting in July. But for this presentation, I've used a lot of other information that comes from newspaper sources and online community forums of people who talk about carbon capture and storage and other forms of climate engineering. So yeah, and then just to briefly talk about methods in anthropology. So in anthropology, our main methods are participant observation and ethnography. And participant observation essentially entails going to a community, becoming a part of the community, staying there for a very long time, usually for a PhD project, hopefully up to a year, and getting to know the community from the inside with that regards. So for my master's research, I lived in Iceland. I was on the board of a youth environmental organization researching environmentalism in Iceland. And that's what led to the genesis of this project for my PhD. And so without further ado, I'll just get into the project. So what I'm looking at is different types of climate intervention, and I put experiments in quotation mark in parentheses in Iceland because some of these are experiments, some of these are actually have been developed at commercial scale. So there is carbon capture and storage with direct air capture. This is a partnership between CarbFix and Climeworks. CarbFix is a Icelandic company and Climeworks is a Swiss company, and I'll go into a little bit more about their operating capacity later. There had been experiments with glacier albedo modification through the Bright Ice Initiative, which basically entails putting hollow glass microspheres onto glaciers to increase their reflectivity. There's been experiments with ocean alkalinity enhancement. Rust is a Icelandic company that's planning on doing it in the near future, but some so-called experiments, and I'll get into why I call it so-called later, has been participated through Running Tide, an American company. And they've also done marine carbon dioxide removal. And so what I'm going to be talking about and building a sort of narrative and story throughout this presentation is the geological, environmental, and social conditions that has made Iceland a site for these experiments and projects, and how these conditions have been used in public engagement, but also in public relations by these companies to create Iceland as this place for these experiments and kind of generate a certain social license for carrying out these projects. And so to start with, I'll be talking about Running Tide and their recent projects. So Running Tide first came to Iceland in 2022, and I have this little short phrase, from hero to zero, because when they first came to Iceland, there was a lot of hype around their projects and their plans, which entailed marine carbon dioxide removal through, their plans were to deploy these wooden buoys into the ocean off the coast of Iceland, have algae grow onto these wooden buoys, and then sink them as a form of marine carbon dioxide removal. This is essentially what they said they would do, but this isn't exactly what they carried out. So what they actually ended up doing, which was recently revealed in this article, this in-depth investigative journal article by Heimildin, which is a local Icelandic newspaper, they exposed that by interviewing oceanographers and other experts who have looked into carbon dioxide removal, is that essentially all they did was took a pile of about 19,000 tons of wood chips and then dumped it off the coast of Iceland. And so there wasn't actually the algae growth on there that was supposed to capture the carbon. And essentially, they didn't live up to what they planned and that they said they were going to do. And they were able to do this essentially because of a series of behind-the-scenes political machinations they expose also in this report, where they first used a company called Transition Labs. They approached this Icelandic billionaire named David Helgason and said, hey, we want to do this, because they knew David Helgason might be interested in this project. And so David Helgason then founded the company Transition Labs to make an Icelandic partner for Running Tide, which meant that, and then he used his connections within Iceland to essentially make Running Tide exempt from environmental monitoring by the Icelandic Environmental Authority. And instead, they did have a independent review of their research done by Ocean Visions. There was a collection of experts that was used from that. And my point is not to say that that this scientific body and that using Ocean Visions is less credible from a scientific perspective. But my point is to talk about the sort of public perception this had on running tides and on geoengineering in Iceland after it turned out, after this report came out, which became Heimildin's most read article over the course of the last year. And so Running Tide eventually shuttered in 2024, receded from Iceland due to a lack of funding to continue carrying out their projects. They're mostly funded by Shopify and Microsoft through selling carbon credits for their activities. But the oceanographers and other people interviewed by Heimildin basically called into question whether they actually delivered the carbon dioxide removal that they claimed to. So I'll spend a little bit of time on this. And so basically also quoted in the Heimildin report was a local climate law expert, who was concerned about the example of the Running Tide and how this exposed a significant gap in Icelandic regulations on CDR and CCS, and how these and concerns that these projects were allowed to be carried out before these regulations were put in place. And I think this, to me, and through talking with others, demonstrates how the Arctic and Iceland as part of the Arctic and part of the subarctic has been constructed as an open laboratory for these kinds of experiments and for circumvention of normal regulatory and governance frameworks for this type of research. I'm not going to read the whole quote, but this is also compounded with conceptions of island laboratories. So Iceland as an Arctic and island laboratory has been partially constructed for these kind of experiments. And this also goes along with narratives of the idea of sacrifice zones, and the Arctic has been long considered a sacrifice zone, a place that is written off for environmental destruction in the name of higher purpose, such as national interest, which is slightly different in the case of marine carbon dioxide removal in these kind of experiments, but there's the same connotations of dumping or using these places as areas to sequester our carbon for the rest of the world. And I think this comes off more in the other second definition of sacrifice zone of areas that have been offered up for exploitation in the name of profit progress and technological advancement. And this is especially true in the case of Running Tide, a for-profit company that created hype around their projects without securing and delivering on what they actually said they were going to do. So just to briefly talk about carbon capture and storage, Iceland, like I said, it's a partnership between Carbfix and Climeworks. And the Icelandic geographer has written about renewable energy in Iceland and potentially geoengineering like carbon capture and storage becoming part of a steamscape of modernity, which basically is in line with the mitigation deterrence argument of, and I think what is really interesting in reflecting on the plenary when they were talking about the potential evidence of mitigation deterrence and whether it's actually been demonstrated. I think the case of Iceland can give us some first steps into thinking about that. I'm not trying to say there's a clear link, and I'm not trying to prove it, but it's pretty striking to me of the local perceptions, and I'll get into those a little bit later, around carbon capture and storage in Iceland, based on the amount of sequestration that has actually been delivered so far. So the two largest operating plants in Iceland, and I believe Mammoth is the current largest operating plant in the entire world. And together, they have an expected capture rate of about 40,000 tons of carbon per year, which pales in comparison to the 41.6 billion tons of carbon emitted globally in 2024, or Iceland's annual emissions rate of about 3.5 billion tons. And to put that in perspective, Iceland in 2019 was the highest net greenhouse gas emitter in tons per capita. And I just love this graph because it shows how stark and how high above they are with the rest of Europe. And this is mostly from wetlands and the drained wetlands, which has been a topic of interest and of environmental NGOs as well as the government for many, many, many years to restore these wetlands. But there's been a lot of public backlash, mostly from farmers who are concerned that because these wetlands were originally drained for agriculture, and most of them are not actually used for agriculture. I can give you the statistics afterwards if you're curious. But these farmers believe that maybe in the near future, with climate change making Iceland a warmer place to live, then that agriculture might be actually more feasible on these areas and make Iceland more self-sufficient. And I put this next to a screenshot of Bill Gates's Netflix series, What's Next? The Future with Bill Gates, that featured Carbfix. And just to say that, just to sort of provide some of the narratives and sort of media narratives that have been constructed around carbon capture and storage, despite its in Iceland, despite its very early stages, and yeah, essentially. And so, going more to the public perception and engagement aspects of this, there is plans by Carbfix to expand their efforts even higher, to increase the capacity extremely on scales much higher, in terms of the millions of tons. And this was manifest in the Coda terminal, which is a project to import carbon dioxide from northern Europe and store it in the ground in Iceland. So they would be doing it through a ship, as you can see in this diagram. But the first Coda terminal that was proposed for Hafnarfjörður, which is a town near Reykjavik, was eventually canceled because of a public backlash. And this public backlash started around July 2024, which was around the time that Running Tide left Iceland and that the Hamilton News report came out exposing Running Tide. Again, not trying to show a direct correlation, but I think the coincidence is telling. And the concerns of the residents, they formed this Facebook group where they're sharing their ideas, sharing newspaper reports, and sharing their concerns about these projects, but also writing in op-eds and speaking publicly at public meetings around these technologies. Basically, their concerns boil down to the possible contamination of local ecosystems and protected lava, the devaluation of homes, increased noise, and the finances involved in building a new report. And I think it's really interesting to also note that a lot of the language they used for carbon capture and storage for these carbon, they called it importing foreign substances and waste that was funded by foreign capital and private interests. So this just kind of gives you a sense of, despite all of the hype and some of the public perception of Iceland, of people within Iceland supporting carbon capture and storage, there is still great resistance. And as you can see, it is quite visceral. I'll just skip this slide really quick, but this is just to say that Carbfix was not anticipating a lot of these sort of concerns or responses, And so they try to very quickly write a bunch of public media reports, op-eds, things like this, and use different techniques to address these issues. And what I found that it was mostly too little too late because they failed to steer the narrative. They didn't engage in public engagement on a significant enough scale. They didn't talk to these community members in the ways that they wanted to be talked to, which I think is the biggest concern. And I'll talk a little bit more about some do's and don'ts and what I've sort of learned from studying these developments, and also what I'm planning to do and do better in a public engagement series of workshops that I'm doing through an ARIA-funded project called How to Speak About Climate Cooling. So I'll just let you take a picture, look at these at your leisure, because there's a lot of points here, but I'll just go into the project and how these do's and don'ts inspired our project idea. So basically, we're focusing on the Arctic and the UK, and with the Arctic, our plan is to collaborate with local Arctic communities to speak with them before we even carry out workshops, to develop how they want to actually want the information or want these workshops to go about. Do they want to, and our focus is ideally climate intervention technologies, but if they want to talk about something else to do with the environment and climate, we're also creating space for that, because we don't want to be like, okay, we want to tell you about this thing, then we want to see what you think about it, but it's about this co-creative process. And this is especially important because we plan on working with Indigenous partners, and so we want to center the possibility of Indigenous knowledges and ways of knowing in these workshops to have them considered along the scientific information and knowledge. And then in the UK, we're doing some long-term engagement with citizen assemblies, and you can talk to me more about that later, but I really wanted to focus on the Arctic project for this specific presentation. And yeah, that's all I have for now. You can scan this QR code. It'll let you know, or you can just email me or come after me to talk about this more. So thank you.
Okay, thank you, Cody, for such intriguing case from Thailand. Okay, so now thank you. Of course, first is thank you to all our speakers for those insightful presentations. And now we are open for the floor for our question and answer. May I request and may I invite all our speakers, Dr. Portia Adade Williams, Dr. Shaun Fitzgerald, Professor Sadique Rahman, Cody Skahan, to please take their seats here in front of us as we begin the open forum. And okay, yes. Okay, to our audience, you may raise your hand, and if your question is directed to our speaker, you may mention their name. And let's keep our question brief and allow us as many voices as possible. Okay. Who will first take the first question to our speakers?
I have a couple of very short questions for Shaun for the project. First, did you track the IP or the region of the IP of the search on the website? Because it could be interesting to see if there is a reproduction of the same region across the searches and things like this. And the second question that I have, it's related to the discussion that we had this morning about potential manipulation. So if I understood you correctly, you say that if we want to keep the attention of the public, it needs to have a specific spin, a positive spin, the message that is carried. But we know also that there is some framing effect getting into place. So when people are first exposed to geoengineering, the way that geoengineering is introduced, if it's with more positive or negative spin, might impact their acceptance of the technologies, and later on will shape what they think and what they can support or not. So one consequences of applying your advice to have this positive spin, could it be that you had a framing effect on those people who visit those websites, do those searches, who are not very knowledgeable about climate change, climate engineering beforehand? Question.
So, so I need to clarify in terms of just the data that we were collecting from Google Trends. It was anonymized, and in terms of so there's a certain level of abstraction that we have to be mindful of, and that's to do with GDPR, so we certainly can't go down to individuals. I think it was you were able to identify countries, but we're very careful in terms of just the other information. So the comment about the framing is not necessarily about a story on geoengineering. Actually, the framing is about the stories that trigger interest in, say, geoengineering. So actually, an energy story, and I think that's what's really important. It's big, the influence on geoengineering is bigger than stories on geoengineering, and I think that's sort of one of the big takeaways. And hence the question I have, which was, look, are you going to use sort of, do we think that stories saying, look, it's gloom and doom versus, we're making some progress on the energy transition, we're just not moving fast enough. And they trigger different levels of interest in, well, what else can we do? Because, the evidence is suggesting that, this crisis, emergency, disaster, people shut down, and that's what's sort of indicating this. And therefore, working with the media about, what we can do to sort of get people to sort of do more. So even if it's behavior, there was maybe not levels of geoengineering. Why should you change your lifestyle if it's all gloom and doom anyway? So actually, if there is an opportunity, it's just shedding insight in terms of how do you trigger what kind of interest in people. And we're leaving it at that. I'm not coming up with any recommendations. It's just trying to sort of get an insight from what we're reading and how we respond to that.
Okay. Any more question? Yes.
I have a question for you, Cody. Because what you presented on Running Tide is a cautionary tale on what happens if you don't follow the right engagement and ethical principles. And I'll open it to the panel as well. How do you think we can proceed in terms of getting this research to follow ethical principles? And is it education? It's not enforcement, I don't believe. But how do we make this happen, where the research is going forward with ethical practices?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think a lot of this does have to do with science communication, public education around these topics. And I think part of it is that in Iceland there's been this sort of, these long environmental histories, these sort of recent tales of energy that's been developed, renewable energy projects that's been developed and created a certain sense of consciousness in Iceland as having, I didn't show it, but there's been some news reports also, basically from external sources, but of Iceland having solved climate change through renewable energy and through carbon capture and storage, despite the level of emissions, especially from drained wetlands, which I think is quite shocking. So I think a lot of it is this sort of explaining to the public, because when they don't understand where the real source of emissions are, they don't understand, like they have this feeling that companies like Rising Tide and Carbfix are saving the world, saving Iceland, then they're not going to have that public scrutiny of projects like Running Tide until it comes out afterwards what they were actually doing. And I think because I'm a bit cynical about Iceland in terms of its environmental governance and projects like these, partly because of the case of Running Tide, but also there's some histories of corruption that's maybe not to the scale of many other places, but there's many other cases I can talk about if you'd like. And so I think what it really is, and what's been demonstrated to actually try to have an effect in Iceland is this public scrutiny. For example, after the financial collapse, it came out that a lot of the politicians and bankers were involved in having offshore bank accounts in the Cayman Islands, and lots of these other issues that helped precipitate the financial collapse in Iceland that affected it significantly more than many other countries. And so there was these protests, large protests that basically brought the government to account, led to new elections, led to talks about building a new constitution, which hasn't been done. But I think it's this sort of increased and continued sustained public scrutiny by education and explaining what's happening and what these kind of issues are.
Okay. Time check. We only have 3 minutes left, so I think we can accommodate 2 persons.
Question for Cody. That slide of do's and don'ts, and it went by really quickly. But you mentioned sort of parenthetically that sometimes when you want to engage on a particular issue, you have to begin with issues that are important to the people you're trying to engage, and then use that as a bridge towards other topics. Could you elaborate a bit on that?
Yeah, sure. So I think it depends significantly on the audience, and I should have mentioned that with our project, with the ARIA project, we're also trying to create a process or a toolkit rather than this sort of guidelines of it, they are guidelines, but it's about how to actually build relations with people, and I think that's the really key takeaway is it's not about it's about listening, it's about building these relations over time, which is hard, but that's what anthropologists do, and that's what we work on. So it's about demonstrating that, like, intimately, that you care about their issues and you understand them intimately and from this inside perspective through developing these relationships. And so I think for public engagement projects or other projects that are trying to do public engagement because they're doing experiments with climate engineering, you should have social scientists on the team, and preferably social scientists who are embedded within these communities already and have existing relations, and so they can actually use these existing relations to demonstrate and talk about what the issue is. And yeah, hope that answers your question.
Thank you. I want to thank all the speakers, and I was super impressed by the work, particularly done by Ghana, and understood that you have come a long way compared to where we are in Norway on this issue. So kudos to you for that. I want to draw the attention to Ocean Visions have done this very comprehensive study of how to actually move decision makers' positions using different language. And then I have a question for Shaun in that regard, because one of the things that they found is that using the term of geoengineering makes it more difficult to communicate with people. So they suggest that we use climate interventions instead. So I'm just curious on why climate interventions was not one of the words that you use for your Google search.
Oh, saved by the, no, I'm not saved by the bell. That's a very good question, Marianne. I need to check actually that table. I'm not sure is the full list, but we were trying to look at a whole raft of different kinds of ideas, and I completely agree. There's a lot of baggage associated with geoengineering, but as we've spoken about and heard over the last 2.5 days, the kinds of language that we use does affect people's reactions, and I think the jury is out as to therefore what kind of language we should be using. I mean, ARIA alone have wrestled with this in terms of the framing for their own program, and it's evolved over the last 18 months. So I think it's a really hot topic to figure out actually what the best way of communicating is.
So finally, our session is ended. So thank you to all our speakers for that compelling presentations, and of course to our audience for that, very entertaining questions, and of course for our audience that really they made the thoughtful questions. Thank you, everyone. It's already 1 p.m. in the afternoon. That's all. And we have